having to be a producer here. Uh, Forgot to start recording, so we'll start doing that now. Again, welcome. Um, uh, we have a surprisingly sizable group given the weather we just endured and the hour of the day and all that. I want to first of all express my thanks to Regina, who with her swaying let me know that I actually was successful in playing the music. Uh, so that's a good thing as well. We are, I suspect many of you, even if you've ordered the book, you may not have received it, again, due to the weather. Let me encourage you, if at all possible, to order the book and try to get it and to read it. In general, it's a good idea when studying a book and what the author says. To read it and not depend simply on the teacher. Now, I like to favor myself that I'm a pretty good reader, interpreter of texts. I've done it a good bit here. But at the same time, while I think I will be fair and objective in a certain sense of presenting it, we all bring different life experience, different backgrounds to a study of a text. And so while I may have certain focus, certain emphases, you may say, well, I think this is important. Let's talk about this part. So in general, it's a good idea, but it's especially important when reading something like Cone's The Spiritual and the Blues, because I'm not an African-American. And they need to have their own voice. And you can't depend on me to accurately or perfectly or adequately give voice to it all the time. And so I would really encourage you to get the text. If you're a little bit concerned about the musical material, you needn't be. Jim is focusing in this book primarily on the lyrics, though he does allude a lot to the musical style as well. There's only one or two places today where there's some, if you will, technical musical stuff, and it's not very hard to understand. And so if that concerns you, please don't feel that as well. And then finally, before we get into the text, I would encourage you, there are enough of us here, we don't have to really worry about raising our hands or those kind of things. Unmute yourself and pipe up, ask questions, make comments, anything like that. Okay, those are the quote ground rules. And so we'll do it that way, okay? Okay, any rebuttals? I'm gonna let someone else in here. Okay, good. All righty then. Today, the book has an introduction and 6 chapters. We have 6 sessions here in Lent, Sunday school sessions. And so today we'll do the introduction and the first chapter. And as I said, I suspect most of you have not had a chance to get the book yet. If you have, great. I'll talk you through some of the stuff here. And then we'll just do a chapter a week. So next week, chapter 2, and on through chapter 6. Cone begins the introduction with this very autobiographical statement. He writes, "The power of song in the struggle for Black survival, that is what the spirituals and the blues are about." And then he talks about growing up in a small Black community in Bearden, Arkansas. The Beatties can probably talk to us about Bearden. He talks about being at the juke joints on Saturday night, and on Sunday morning being at the Macedonia AME Church worship service. And indeed, where the Spirit was emphasized, the power of God unto salvation, that wheel in the middle of the wheel. And he writes, "The Spirit was God breaking into the lives of the people, building them up where they were torn down, and propping them up on every leaning side. The Spirit was God's presence with the people and God's will to provide them the courage and the strength to make it through. And the people were thankful for God's presence and renewed weekly their covenant to hold out to the end. I can hear it now. My mother is singing her favorite song. Try this again. Every time I feel the Spirit. This is an older version recording by, I'm messing up here. Like I said, I'm not the greatest producer in the world. Roland Hayes. Every time I feel the Spirit.
Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. On the mountain, my Lord spoke. Out of his mouth came fire and smoke. In the valley, on my knees, ask my Lord, have mercy, please. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Jordan River, chilly and cold, chills the body but not the soul. All around me looks so fine. Ask my Lord if all were mine. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray.
Cone goes on to say that at the are we good? Okay. At the Macedonia AME Church, the melody, rhythm, and style were black. The mood was black, and the people were black. Everything they did was a valiant attempt to define and structure the meaning of blackness, so that their children and their children's children will be a little freer than they were. They had a hard road to hoe and a rocky road to travel, and they had made it and intended to make it through the storm. And we heard some of that in Mahalia Jackson's piece right at the beginning, in which she expresses, Lord, don't move the mountain, and help me make the climb there as well. So this is essentially the whole point of Cone's book, which is the music that grew out of the Black community at church, yes, but he also talks about the juke joints on Saturday night, defined and structured for them the meaning of Blackness over against a white culture. And this is really important. He goes on, by the way, and says that Black music must be lived before it can be understood. And I wanted to say a couple things here, and I'd be interested in hearing from the rest of you, your reactions. Firstly, that's kind of intimidating for a bunch of white folk like us to hear that. It has to be lived before it can be understood. I was reading about a Canadian music lover studying jazz music, and he had read this passage by Cone, and that same thought occurred to him. I mean, what could a white Canadian possibly have anything significant to offer by the way of an engagement with the work of a Black American jazz musician. He was studying the music of John Coltrane. And so he went and visited Cone, who, by the way, just to give you a background, he died just a few years ago and was for many years professor of theology at the Union Theological Seminary in New York. And so he went to see Jim Cone in his office, and he's talking about his trepidation. What's a bunch? We can personalize it. What's a bunch of white folk like us doing here? And he turns out, he says, James Cone is a nuanced thinker. He said very generously, I think you have to go to where the music has been created and get to know the people who created it. And so for him, he said, since he was in New York, go to Harlem, join local congregations for worship, and listen to music in some of the neighborhood clubs. And that, I think that's part and parcel. We're not Black. We cannot directly go through and understand what it means to be Black in America yet to today. And yet, by sharing in their lives and through the virtue of empathy, we can come to understand something of it. This is the second thing I'll say in this regard. And then I would really be interested if any of you have anything to offer in this regard. For a long time, before I could articulate the reasons why, I was always nervous whenever a Black singing group who performed this kind of music would come to a white church or a white audience. And I could never articulate why. But whenever I was in a Black church, I was privileged at one point to attend worship service at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. The same music was very different in terms of how it felt, how it struck me. And I think this is something that Cone is getting at, and that I want to get at too. As he says in the book, to understand the music, you have to share the spirit and participate in the faith of those who created it. And I'm going to say a little bit more why he articulates it in the way he does, and I think it's very good. But I'd be interested, have any of you have any interaction in this regard and would like to contribute to comments? Please feel free to do so.
Whenever I've been in a choir where we've had to sing spirituals, I felt incredibly uncomfortable. It feels weird to be trying to enunciate as if we're slaves singing spirituals. I don't know. I know just what you mean. It just feels out of context and yet just uncomfortable with it. So
it feels a little bit artificial, doesn't it? For us to be, for me, to be trying to express something that I haven't experienced in a way. Not that I shouldn't try, but it's different.
This may sound odd, but I didn't feel that as much if we sang spirituals in a choir in Australia, because I think slavery was just so distant to us that to us it was like singing a German song or something else, you know, that we would try and enter into how, what they were communicating, how it was created. But when I came here and I just understood so much more about that feeling, then yes, I feel that too here now. One thing that strikes me with a lot of this music is that they really sort of are entered into what they're singing. And so their phrasing and enunciation is very much that, you know, it's very clear, the words are clear, but I think a lot of our music, and in particular somehow a lot of Christian music, people will sing a hymn and it's the way the music goes, and they will take a breath mid-phrase or even mid-word, as opposed to keeping to whole sentence structure. And I think with certainly what we've heard this morning, but just in most of that music that I've heard, is that they're really telling you a story, or they're really feeling it. So they're full sentences, full phrases, you know, it's full communication. It's not just an art form of here's the sound.
Excellent. I like the way you put that, because that's, Cohen is going to say something very similar to that in this regard. I do remember the one time I went to Abyssinian Baptist Church. I was with a group of academics. It was a Bonhoeffer conference. And it was kind of funny because, by the way, Abyssinian Baptist Church is a very cosmopolitan place. The choir sang two special numbers. One was a spiritual like this. The other was a Bach chorale. So, you know, they do that. But during the congregational singing, it was funny. You saw all these old German theologians, and at first they didn't know what to do. But then they kind of got into it, and it was really funny to see the transformation of that. By the way, Bonhoeffer, the reason we went to Abyssinia was Bonhoeffer went there in 1930 and 31 when he was in New York. And he took a bunch of spirituals back to Germany with him, and he played it for his students at the illegal seminary in New York, in Germany during the National Socialism. So he was also someone who saw that as well. Did anyone else want to make an observation there?
I do. Barry, what drew him there?
What drew
Bonhoeffer to Abyssinian?
He met while he was at Union, one of the few Black students who was attending the seminary, a man by the name of Frank Fisher. And let's just be honest, Bonhoeffer was not terribly impressed with the theology at Union or the preaching in the white churches in New York. He tried Union Seminary, he tried the Conservative Presbyterian Church down the street, Broadway. He went with Frank Fisher to Abyssinian, and he said, this is the gospel in America. As a matter of fact, he was so enamored of what he was in there, he became the 6th grade boys Sunday school teacher. Just this, neither here nor there, but just a story that some of you've heard. We were there in 1992, and after the worship service, we were kind of standing and talking, and a woman came up to us who was in her 70s, and was very gracious, asked us why we were there, and we told her that we were studying the theology of a young German scholar who worshiped here in 1930 and 31. And you have to understand, Bonhoeffer was as blonde as you can be. And so I'm sure he stood out in that Black congregation. And she said, so that's who that was. She remembers this blonde head in the worshiping in the church. She had no idea who it was, but she remembered as a young girl, Bonhoeffer being in the worship. So yeah, that's good. By the way, one of the things he talks about here, when he talks about feeling the spirit and experience, he's not talking about what we oftentimes think of experience as something personal and inward. He's talking about what may better be called the lived experience of a people. It's a communal as well as personal. And so as you read, when you get a copy of the book, and as I talk about it today, you would keep that as mind. He has some interesting things to say about this. He talks about Black music as being unifying, summoning both the joy and the sorrow, the love and the hate, the hope and despair of Black people. And this is really important. I'll talk a little bit more about this in connection with something that W.E.B. Du Bois talked about in his study of Black spirituals. He called it the sorrow songs of the Black community. And then here, go back to something Susie said. He says that Black music is functional. Now, that word can be misconstrued, and I'm going to give an alternative to it in a minute. But he says something here that I think Susie alluded to. In a later chapter, he says, in Africa and America, Black music was not an artistic creation for its own sake. It was directly related to daily life, work, and play. And I want to be heard here carefully here. What he's saying basically is that Black music is not art for art's sake. Now, don't get me wrong. I think art for art's sake can be wonderful. Go to museums, go to galleries, go to concerts, that's fine. But this is not what Black music is about, he says. It has a certain function. And here's the word I'm going to use for it. Black music is liturgical. Okay. The word liturgy comes from a Greek word that means the work of the people, the public work of the people. And this gets to the notion that the music in the churches and in the juke joints gave shape and definition to who they were. It wasn't entertainment, which I think what some of us have been talking about so far. When we hear Black music, it can be a kind of entertainment. It's not a concert in a sense. It gives shape and meaning to their lives in ways that other settings for music do not. And to give a sense of that, Sarah and I went to Italy a few years ago with Eric and Jenny, enjoyed it tremendously. One of the places we went was to Florence. One of my colleagues at Baylor, who's an art history professor, says that 80% of the world's great art is in Italy, 80% of that is in Florence, and 80% of that is in the Uffizi Museum. But recently, within the last year, the director of the Uffizi Museum says that the church music, the church art, should be returned to the churches from which they came, because they don't mean the same thing in a museum context as they do in the churches, which is, I was glad to hear the director say that, because as great as the Uffizi was, as great as the Academy where the great statue of David is, and it is, if you've ever have an opportunity to see it or you have seen it, it's a masterful work. I was always more taken, more grabbed, if you will, by the art that was in churches. Because it was part of, they weren't works of art, they were works of devotion. They were works of worship. And I think what Jim Cohn is getting to here is very much along that lines. And indeed, the way he talks about it later is that there is an inseparable bond in Black music between Black life and Black art. The Eastern Orthodox talk about the liturgy, the public work of the church, and then the liturgy after the liturgy, which is the way the liturgy has shaped your living, your overall understanding of and direction of life. And so I think that's what he's getting at too. Just a couple more things from the introduction. And again, comments, jump in. He says, Black music is also social and political. It is social because it is Black and thus articulates the separateness of the Black community. It is an artistic rebellion against the humiliating deadness of Western culture. Black music is political because in its rejection of white cultural values, it affirms the political otherness of Black people. Through song, a new political consciousness is continuously created, one antithetical to the values of white society. Just be warned. Jim Cone pulls no punches when it comes to talking about this stuff. Okay. You can't read Cone and gain what we all need to gain from it by being sensitive. And again, James Cone was very gracious in person. I had a couple of opportunities to talk to him and get to know him a little bit. And it's not rejection of white people, but it is a rejection and a resistance against what happened to Black people in slavery, which is where the spirituals come from, and later during Jim Crow segregation, and which in many ways continues to today. We need look no further than East Waco, where the last part of the community to get power back was East Waco, where most African Americans live in Waco. So I encourage us to listen, to hear, to think through. While Cone will give us the first word on these matters, he would never say he has the last word, but these are things to be pondered as well. And then finally, and he says this in a couple of different ways, Black music is also theological. It tells us about the divine spirit that moves people toward unity and self-determination. It is not possible to be Black and encounter the spirit of Black emotion and not be moved. My purpose is to uncover the theological presuppositions of Black music. And later on, in a later chapter, he will express it, reaffirm this. He says, my contention is there is a complex world of thought underlying the slave songs that he thinks has escaped analysis. And what he's doing here, I would argue, is he is challenging and transgressing the binaries that we tend to fall into, that we think something is either personal or communal. We think something is intellectual or emotional. And he wants to reject that. The emotion that's encountered through the spirituals also has theological substance to it. And indeed, if you think about it, if you feel strongly about something, to say it's about something involves some kind of recognition, some kind of understanding of things. And so he wants to, like I said, transgress those binaries that we typically fall into. There have been numerous times I've heard people say, you got to get out of your head. Well, no, you can't ever get out of your head, but you have to keep head and heart together. And I think that's what Jim Cone is trying to get at. That's basically the introduction. It's a pretty meaty introduction, so I wouldn't, when you get your copy, I would not avoid it. Any questions or comments to this point?
Barry, I just add that if folks haven't seen the Black Church documentary on PBS that aired this week, there's a really good connection between the story that Gates is telling and the music of the African American church that I think would just be a helpful kind of context to some of the work that we're doing here. And they do get to Cone towards the end of that series. So just as something to kind of complement the work that in reading we're doing here, that's a really helpful overview.
Regina, thanks for reminding me about that. Yeah, unfortunately, I couldn't watch it this week because I didn't have power. But I plan to do that. It's a PBS special. And so I would encourage us to look at it. And the important part of it is it emphasizes the absolutely crucial role that the Black church plays and that the spirituals, the music play within the church. And as I'll be talking about it a little bit as I get into chapter 1, in which he deals a little bit with what I would call the genealogy of the spirituals. It is both the Black spirituals both deal with the here and the hereafter. It's not one or the other. The spirituals enable them to survive, enable them to affirm their somebodiness, as King was fond of putting it, and yet was also a very authentic, sincerely expressed devotion to and engagement with the God of the Bible. Anyone else before we go on?
Just talking about the sort of the function of the music. And it doesn't always have to be actually Black music or a Black spiritual. I'm reminded of when Obama went and he was with the mourners and he was speaking. So he didn't just sort of sit in Charlotte's. No, sorry, gone blank.
At the funeral.
Yeah, no, at the funeral for the shooting in the Black church. I've just gone blank for a minute. But where Obama was speaking, and then he said he hadn't intended to sing Amazing Grace, but as sort of part of his homily, but he was just talking and he said it just sort of came out of him. And it just seemed so unifying and it just spoke to everybody there. And, you know, it was part of his message, as it turns out. You know, it was a function, even though it wasn't a specific Black spiritual that they would have all known. You know, it was sort of white music in a way, but it was used in their way.
Oh, yeah. Excellent observation. In the post, during the era of segregation, spirituals morphed on the one hand into the blues, which morphed into the jazz. But in church, it morphed into what is typically now thought of as gospel music. And so, matter of fact, a lot of the spirituals that you can access online are actually sung according to a kind of gospel style, which is fine, well, and good. One of the reasons I played the Hayes version, Roland Hayes version of Every Time I Feel the Spirit, is because it was as close as I could get, I think, to the way those songs would have originally been put. But you're exactly right. One of the things, you know, you're in an African-American church when the preacher starts singing part of the way through his sermon, okay? And people will start singing with him. And again, it's not entertainment. It's not even a religious type concert. At some churches, the choir will be singing softly during the sermon, during portions of the sermon. And the people will join in. And it's a very different liturgical style. Less a presentation and more a collaboration on the part of everyone there. And so it is fascinating as well. Okay. Moving on then to the first chapter, in which he deals a little bit with the interpretation of the Black spirituals. One of the things he talks about is that one of the reasons he wrote this book is because he didn't think there was some really good analysis of the Black spirituals. And so, as any good theologian and professor would do, he surveys some of the work that had been done. And one of the things he talks about is the debate that went on in terms of the cultural antecedents for the slave songs. Were they white music, mostly African music? You know, where were the main sources? And he talks about there's definitely both there. Indeed, at one point he writes, there is a limited usefulness to a debate over the degree of originality in slave songs. What he reminded me of there was the arguments people will get into with a baby. Who does the baby take after more, the mom or the dad, whose family it takes over? And it's kind of a useless debate, right? In some ways, it's important to acknowledge that both parents contribute to the genetic makeup of a baby, its appearance. And this, in the same way, the slave songs are an amalgam of the church music that was being sung and but also the African influence that was brought to this continent on slave ships. One of the earliest people to study the slave songs was W.E.B. Du Bois in his classic book, The Souls of Black Folk. And he goes in here and talks about in the slave songs, which he calls the soul American music. He said the songs relate to the cultural history of Black people striving for humanity in a society of oppression and racial hatred. They were the most beautiful expression of human experience born this side of the sea. He called them sorrow songs because they were music of an unhappy people, of the children of disappointment. They tell of death and suffering and unvoiced longing toward a truer world, of misty wanderings and hidden ways. But, he goes on and says, Du Bois perceived something else in the beauty of the spirituals, an affirmation of life. Through all the sorrow of the sorrow songs, there breathes a hope of faith in the ultimate justice of things. I went back and was looking at this it's the concluding chapter to the book, The Souls of Black Folk. And there was a passage here that I remember just really caught me. He's talking about the way white people will refer to the United States as their country. Indeed, we've heard affirmation of that as well. So he writes, your country, how came it yours? Before the pilgrims landed, we were here. Here we have brought our three gifts and mingled them with yours, a gift of story and song. And then here, listen to the way he puts it. Soft, stirring melody in an ill-harmonized and unmelodious land. I mean, that line itself sings. Let me say it again. Soft, stirring melody in an ill-harmonized and unmelodious land. He goes on and says, the gift of sweat and brawn to beat back the wilderness, conquer the soil, and lay the foundations of this vast economic empire 200 years earlier than your weekends could have done it. Third, a gift of the Spirit. Around us, the history of the land has centered for thrice 100 years. Out of the nation's heart, we have called all that was best to throttle and subdue all that was worst. Fire and blood, prayer and sacrifice have billowed over this people, and they have found peace only in the altars of the God of right. To me, that Du Bois puts it so well in that regard. One other thing in connection with Du Bois that Cone talks about is the way Du Bois was fascinated by the tension in the spirituals, tension between hope and despair, joy and sorrow, death and life, and by the ability of Black slaves to embrace such polarities in their music. Now, I said there wouldn't be a whole lot of technical musical terminology here, but I think this notion of tension is very important. Music operates through tension. And it need not mean dissonance. Even harmonies have this tension. Tension simply means things can't be left as they are. They're moving forward towards some kind of resolution. Just to give you a simple example, what's your first impulse when you hear me sing, dun, 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 dun? Yeah, you want the next phrase, right? Dun, 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 dun. Okay. And even a simple song, Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. You can't be left there. That's tension. And tension drives the music forward, always leaning forward towards some kind of resolution. And this is so important, says Cone, in Black music. This tension between the present sorrow and the hope for what is to come. And it's embodied in all music, particularly in so-called Western music, but is especially important here in this regard. I have one more song to play, so I have to keep an eye on the clock here. He goes through several of the scholars who studied the spirituals. He mentions one important, a man by the name of Howard Thurman, yet another important African-American scholar. And one of the things that Cone points out from Thurman's writing is that the Black spiritual is an expression of the slave's determination to be. The essence of antebellum Christianity was the emphasis on the somebodyness of Black slaves. This somebodyness is an expression that Martin Luther King Jr. was very fond of. In a society that conveyed at every opportunity the nobodiness of African Americans, this music was to affirm the somebodyness of Black slaves. And as he writes, God is the sovereign ruler. Death cannot be the master of life. Through the songs, Black slaves affirmed the universal dimensions of the human spirit and its transcendence over spiritual life. One of the final things that he covers in this first chapter is the debate between did the songs refer to social and historical events in the present? Do they refer to the kingdom of God, the city of heaven, what is to be at the end of the age? Or as I put it, do the songs refer to the here or the hereafter? And Cone argues, and I think he's right, you don't have to choose. They're both, and affirming the connection between the two. One of the spirituals, and I forgot to, again, a lousy producer here, I forgot to get a copy of it. But you can hear that expressed in the spiritual. Didn't my God deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Didn't my God deliver Daniel? Why not every man? Okay. So you hear the tension, the suffering, but also the hope expressed there, calling upon God to do that as well. I have one more thing to play for y'all, but do any of you have comments or questions that you'd like to offer before offering up the final piece of music?
I was just going to mention on a sort of a shopkeeping thing that the book is available on Kindle. If you're an Amazon member, you can have it in 20 seconds.
Good.
And
good.
I think it was $9.99, might have been $2 more than the hard copy, but at least you don't have to waste gasoline having it delivered.
There you go. So I would strongly encourage you to obtain a copy either in print or in electrons, and to read it for yourself, to bring that to bear.
What was the book that you were quoting from Du Bois? What was the book?
Du Bois? Yeah, it's called The Souls of Black Folk. It comes out in a lot of different editions.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is a classic of the 20th century. Not just of Black authors, of all authors. Okay, go ahead.
I have one thing to ask about. You know how at Thanksgiving time and other times during the year, we partner with Ebenezer Baptist Church. I think that's what it is, over on I-35.
Yes.
And that got me to thinking some time ago, I can imagine a future where we would somehow join, if they so chose, join with them in maybe other ways. But I have often wondered about the music. If we shared a worship service together of some sort, how on earth would we handle the music so that it remained authentic and meaningful for each person gathered together? And I have no clue how that might be brought about, but not so much the theology, but the music. I don't know. I think back many years ago when I was a girl, growing up in the Church of Christ, where women just sat and listened. I will never forget that for some reason, a small Black church in East Austin, they did not have anyone to lead a service on a particular Sunday. And so my mother and her best friend went there. And I wish I had a movie of it. I just still can't believe they did that. But they took communion literally in the car with them. And I think Dorothy preached, and I don't know what my mother did. But I think about that, and I just wonder about Ebenezer, and it just seems like it must be so different from Dayspring and our quiet, sacred, and simple service. Is there any common ground musically? Just a question.
No. First of all, that's a very important question to ask, and for the church as a whole to ponder. More immediately, my first impulse is to encourage people to worship with them, perhaps even on a fairly regular basis, to get to know and experience them, to be someone who goes and listens and who's present without the white person being in charge. And so that's what I would first encourage people. And then to pursue the questions you've asked, Candace, I think is so very important. We at Dayspring do have a definite musical and theological style. Again, remember, Cone is very insistent, and I think this is important. The music and the theology goes together. and it shaped them. And indeed, one of the chapters, I think it's chapter 3, he gets into the theology of the spirituals, very much so. And so we'll be dealing with that as well. And so I have no solutions, no plans, no formulas, no blueprints, but I do want to affirm your question. Okay, in closing today, I want to play the song that Time magazine, in their edition on the 20th century, named the most important song of the 20th century. It is called Strange Fruit. It deals with the most horrifying subject in the history of America in terms of race relations, and that is lynching. It was written actually by a Jewish man, the poem was, and then set to music by him and others. The most well-known singer of Black Strange Fruit is Billie Holiday. And that's who I'm going to play here in a moment. She always ended her sets, particularly in nightclubs, with this. And she demanded that during this, when she sang this, they couldn't serve anything. Everyone had to be quiet and still. Couldn't have waiters bustling back and forth. And then she didn't want applause afterwards. And it's exemplary of the style of development of the blues. And so I'm going to finish with this. And I look forward to seeing you and others next week. So without further ado.
Google has a movie on about her. Should watch it.
A couple of you still have your microphones on, so okay, here we go.
And now a little tune written especially for me, Strange Fruit. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rock, for the tree to drop. winter cry.
Until next week, then, again, we'll be on chapter 2 of Cone's.
If you're trying to lose belly fat, stop doing cardio. This sounds backwards, right? Well, believe it.
I love YouTube. Okay. Take care, all.
Thank you, Barry.
Yeah, thank you.